Okay, so let's begin the webinar. A warm good evening to everyone from Life Science Education Trust. I am Maya, your host for the evening, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Talking about Life Science Education Trust, we are a specialized skill development training institute that focuses on animal care, management, and development. We provide comprehensive training programs, including Diploma in Animal Care and Management and Animal Care Boot Camp with the next upcoming batch in January 2026. If you need any further information about the programs, please reach out to the numbers shown on the screen. So the topic for today's webinar is captive breeding of Fringillidae Finches. We are honored to welcome our speaker for the evening, Mr. Oliver Crowther, who's a UK-based conservation aviculturist. Mr. Crowther is the founder of OC Aviary, where he integrates scientific understanding with practical birdkeeping to advance ethical aviculture and species conservation. He also holds a master's degree in bioveterinary science from University of Nottingham with a specialization in avian and exotic animal biology. Mr. Crowther leverages digital media platforms like YouTube and Instagram to educate and engage global audiences, translating complex avian science into accessible, inspiring content. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the virtual stage to our speaker for the evening. Over to you, sir. You may please share your screen and start the presentation.
Right. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction. Really appreciate it. Just want to make sure you can you all see my screen quite well on there?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much. Perfect. So, yes, thank you for the introduction. So we're going to be looking at the captive breeding of Fringillidae family finches today, and the principles, the practices, and the conservation initiatives that come from this and are presented around this. So I want to start off by giving you a couple of definitions as to what all of this means. I think it's important that we start off and make sure that we're all on the. I do apologize. I think I might have got something wrong there. No, I do apologize. So we want to make sure that we're all on the same page here and we all have the correct understandings of what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing is the captive breeding, also known as ex situ breeding. It's the practice of breeding animals in a controlled environment which is separate from the wild. Then we've got aviculture. So aviculture is the practice of keeping and breeding birds in captivity. That is very much something that I'm a specialist in, and I work with a lot of other aviculturists in the UK and Europe to develop skills and knowledge in this. And then finally is selective breeding, and this is the process by intentionally choosing organisms with desirable traits to be bred from. Once again, this is something that I'm going to be discussing in today's presentation. So, Fringillidae family finches. I want to introduce the family group to you all because it's something that some of you might be particularly familiar with and others perhaps not so much. Now, they're a diverse group of species with more than 200 individual species in the family, divided into 50 genera. The meaning of Fringillidae, so Fringilla means finch, and the idae means family. So you've got the true finch family. This is the main group of finches, although there is also other types of finches across the world. Now, Fringillidae family finches, one of the things that make them so special and unique is the fact that they're found all over the world except Australasia and the polar regions. And saying that with Australasia, there's actually been introduced populations from Britain and Europe to Australia and New Zealand of these different species, several of them as a handfuls, and they've inhabited these areas as well. So they're a very diverse group of species that can be found all over the world. Now, the family is believed to have originated in the Old World, so between Africa, Europe, and Asia. This is where we believe that through molecular studies, these birds once had a common ancestor, and then, of course, they spread out across the globe over to the Americas at some point in history. Now, whilst the practices today that I'm going to be discussing are particularly based around my experiences with European finch species, which belong to the subfamily Cardulinae, they will also be relevant for the other subfamilies which exist within Fringillidae, as well as the other Fringillidae family finches that are found in Asia and the Americas as well. So this is going to be quite a broad one that's going to cover many different practices that you're going to see translate across many of the hundreds of different species there are in this family. So, breeding in captivity. Why do we do it? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. The first is for conservation. Numerous species, as we know, are declining worldwide. Therefore, having insurance populations that exist in captivity does bring security to these species, and it allows us to have these areas, these volumes of birds. So should human intervention need to occur for these birds, then we're able to do exactly that by having these populations that exist within captivity. A lot of these birds, particularly in the Fringillidae family, all exist within captive private aviculture. So there is more Fringillidae family finches within private hand, within people's back garden aviaries and their back garden bird rooms, than there is actually in zoological collections. There is many thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of these birds within private hands. So it's very much a popular pastime that has been seen right across Europe, parts of Asia, and is now spreading to the Americas as well. Another part of it is the education behind these birds. So even if we have species of birds that are particularly common in captivity or in the wild, then we can have them to use as model species to learn and build experiences around, allowing husbandry expertise and this really important niche knowledge to occur. So the education in keeping these birds is particularly important as well. And then finally is for the purpose of pets. Now, whilst most finch species, particularly within this family, aren't the best of pets, they can actually be really useful as pet birds because of their singing abilities that we often see with a number of different species, but also they lack that talking ability and that intelligence that you would normally see in city signs, so parrots, parakeets, species like this. So that does make them somewhat common as pet birds. And there's one particular species in this family that dominates the pet bird world, and I'm sure some of you might be able to guess it. It's canaries. So canaries are extremely popular in pet bird circles. And they are a really, really popular species that have been kept for hundreds of years. So canaries were originally caught in the Canary Islands off the coast of North Africa in around the 14th century. So they've had approximately 500 to 600 years of selective breeding and this captive breeding, this domestication to turn them into the birds that we see today. They're highly adaptable, so they really did suit well to becoming captive pet birds, used for song, used for colour, as living ornaments, and also as culturally significant birds that would act as gas detectors in mines. That was a very common use for this species for several hundred years, and also as, once again, songbirds for the rich in Europe that would have them because it sounded lovely having this bird singing all day in your house. So a really popular bird, and also a very useful model as we look at some of these rarer, more endangered Fringillidae family species. Is canaries are really a bird that should be used as a model species when learning about husbandry and the care of these birds, because they are highly adaptable and there's been a lot of research on them in the past. So breeding in captivity then, how do we do it? Well, there's two different ways that we're going to do it, and there's a number of different reasons for why we'll choose one or the other. So the options are cages or aviaries if we're captive breeding them. And there's, like I say, a number of different factors. The first being the domestication of these species. So have the species become habituated to certain environments? Have they been bred for hundreds of years like the canaries, and then they've therefore only ever known cages like you can see on the right-hand side of your screen? Or on the left-hand side of the screen, are they a species that has only ever been bred and kept in aviaries and therefore need that? So the first thing is the consideration of domestication. How used to captive environments are they, and how easy are they to manage within those environments? And the next thing is very much the management of these species. So they're, again, a very diverse group of finches that can have really differing behavior depending on where they originate from, and the evolutionary adaptations that they have occurred over many thousands of years. So we need to look at how intensively managed do these birds need to be. Are they birds that are very much you put two together and it's a hands-off approach and you leave them? Or are they something that need this regular monitoring because they may be more behaviorally complex, and therefore we have to keep much more closer eyes and attention on them to make sure that keeping and breeding them in captivity from a welfare perspective is absolutely positive and very key to that. So I wanted to go through what I'm going to call a case study, and what it's going to be on is a species known as the European hawfinch, so Coccothris. They are a fantastic species to keep, but they are particularly complex in their breeding ecology. They are very difficult to breed in captivity. I've been very fortunate that over the past couple of years I have successfully bred this species, and what's nice about them as part of this webinar today to use as a model is that they have some very simple practices that are key to breeding your simple species like canaries that are used to captivity. And then they also have these other management practices that you have to apply for the most complex species. So they work really well, and it's going to cover a broad range of aspects of captive breeding them. Now, one of the things that make them that difficult is their behavior. They breed strictly in monogamous pairs, so only one male and one female will breed, and they will pair up over the winter months when they're in larger flocks, and then they will go off in their separate ways and occupy a small territory for the breeding season. So very much a bird that breeds in pairs and doesn't like the company of other birds of the same species. They're also very important when it comes to mate choice. So they're really complex. Once again, a very intelligent finch species that mate choice is absolutely critical in breeding them in captivity. So again, that's another management sort of consideration we have to have, is giving them that mate choice to successfully breed them. And it also does lead to larger levels of aggression if there's certain things wrong with that mate choice, for example. So managing the aggression then. The first thing about managing the aggression in this species is how you house them. So this here is just an example of what most breeders of this species will do in order to form pair bonds. As we mentioned, they're an aggressive species, so we have to make sure that they aren't going to compromise the welfare of each other by attacking each other and being aggressive as they start to come into breeding condition. A common practice for this is housing them in cages or aviaries with wire dividers between them. This means that the birds can see each other, they can interact with each other, but they can't physically touch each other with any degree of accuracy. So they aren't going to be able to really cause harm to each other. And this is a very popular management method for this species and has proven to work for many, many decades in captivity. What will often happen with this species is you will introduce them together in around November or December, which is very much the prime of winter when these birds should not be showing any signs of breeding, and introducing them exactly like this. You house them like this for the course of several months with a divider between them so they can't get to each other. And then you introduce them in the spring. And by then, the idea is that the birds will have bonded with each other and will be used to each other's company. So now what's happened is the birds are very much in breeding condition. It's, let's say, April or May sort of time. The birds are wanting to breed. So they've been kept together side by side over the winter. We're now putting them into an aviary together for the first time, where they could, if all things went wrong, they could attack each other and have really big problems from aggression. So we have to manage that once again. There should be, however, minimal aggression because of the preparation you have taken over the winter months by introducing them separately, and a pair bond should have formed. Of course, during this period, close monitoring is absolutely crucial to the success of keeping and breeding this species, because you don't want to end up with these welfare problems of birds being aggressive towards each other. It's particularly necessary for the first 3 to 4 days, where they can physically access each other, they could chase each other. So we have to make sure that there is very close monitoring for that reason. And one of the common methods for this is either spending a lot of time in the aviaries with them, or you have CCTV cameras to keep a close eye whilst you're working on other things. At this time as well, a really good practice is to add the nest site to their aviary. So nest site or nest sites, and you'll cover it with different parts of foliage, whether it be trees from outside, whether it be, as you can see in this photo, this is fake Christmas tree, which is all plastic and wire, so it's just generally a bit more biosecure. But the idea of doing this is it gives something that is a distraction to these birds. So if they are having these destructive behaviors, they can focus it onto something that isn't their partner. Additionally, adding natural perches and natural forage to these birds really encourages them to breed, and also not spend too much time being aggressive with each other. So one of the popular things that I like to do with them is adding fresh pine branches into their aviaries so they can pick off the insects and also the pine cones that are growing on these branches. And it really gives them something to do and brings that activity into the bird. It's a natural stimulus for them, and it really improves the welfare of the birds by doing this. And of course, as the natural availability of these high quality foods starts to come about for these birds, as you put it into their aviaries, they're more likely to breed. And speaking of these highly nutritious diets, this is just a couple of examples what we would feed this species. Now, as I mentioned, Fringillidae family finches are a really diverse group. They've got different adaptations depending on where they've originated from. Some are strictly granivorous and only like to feed on seed. Some of them are frugivores and primarily feed on fruits, and others are insectivores and feed on insects. And then, of course, there is a large number of species that like to do all three, and the hawfinch is absolutely one of those. So they're a species that have an awful lot of nutritional requirements to make sure that the birds are in the absolute best of health. So, insects for these birds. The insects are available all year round. However, you always want to reduce the quantity of these insects because that would naturally follow what is happening in the wild. The insect numbers are increasing during the spring and the summer months, which is when these birds will breed. Therefore, the birds are naturally getting more protein that encourages them to breed. If we give them too many in the winter, it can make them act unnaturally and want to breed earlier than they should do. So we try and mimic nature as much as possible with this species. Again, with fruit, fruit is primarily available for the species in the winter months, copying the natural availability. By the winter months, the fruit is becoming ripe. It will be sat on the trees and is commonly used for migratory birds feeding on for these high quantities of energy and sugars and fat for these birds. So we do exactly the same with the hawfinches. It's giving them fruit in the winter when it would naturally be becoming ripe, and then occasionally you might give them in the spring as berries start to occur on the trees, these very small immature berries, and that really does mimic nature as much as possible. And then finally is the seed of these birds. A high quality seed mixture containing appropriate volumes of various different species of seeds is really important. particularly for the hawfinches. They're a species with a very large beak and an extremely high bite force, so much so that they love to crack some of the hardest seeds and pips that you can find. So we try and offer a really mixed seed mixture to these birds to give them the absolute best nutrition possible, that ranges from very small grass seeds to the largest seeds such as cherry pips. They're absolutely perfect and the birds love them. Again, something that's really important to take away from this about the diet of these birds is mimic nature. These birds have adapted for thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of years for specific nutritional requirements. Therefore, we can mimic nature as much as possible. It's highly likely it will bring success in breeding and keeping these birds in captivity. So, the birds have pair bonded, having spent the winter together. They've been moved into their aviary during the spring and they're coexisting peacefully. The diet is as it would be naturally, so it's perfect by having that high quality that mimics nature and the natural food ability. So they've decided now the birds want to breed. These are just a couple of different elements to breeding this type of finch and many different Fringillidae family finches. There are many other requirements, such as artificially raising the fertility of these birds through various different supplements, manipulating the photo period and the light intensity to influence the bird's behavior at different times of year, and controlling the humidity to suit embryo development. But those are things that we might have to have another webinar on, because we could spend all day talking about these many different factors. So, we've got eggs, and ideally you start to get sites like this. So this here is 4 hawfinch chicks that I bred 2 years ago. Now, this is only the tip of the iceberg when having these birds breeding. Getting them to go to nest is one problem, getting them to have chicks is another, and getting those chicks to survive is another issue as well. Again, these are small bird species. They have high mortality naturally. Therefore, we've got to make sure that the management is spot on to ensure that the chances of success are as high as possible. So pair have obviously proven to be compatible. The bonding has worked that we've spent the winter doing. We've got chicks produced. And it's a major achievement regardless of the species. And at this time, at least for the hawfinches, we're providing really high quality diets again, but this time rearing diets that do differ ever so slightly from what the parent birds would naturally be eating. This is an example of the rearing diets that we offer primarily to most Fringillidae family finches. It depends on what the birds would naturally feed on as to what we're going to feed them to rear their chicks on. But again, this is a very crucial time in the young bird's development. We've got to make sure that the nutrition is absolutely perfect if they're going to successfully grow into adult birds and go back into future breeding programs. So a couple of examples here. We have insects. Primarily, these are what are fed by hawfinches, for example. It's that high protein and energy content that is absolutely crucial for the chick's development. We then have egg food. This is an egg-based crumb that contains some vegetables and insect protein, usually 20 to 25% protein content in this type of food. And it's specifically formulated to meet the nutritional requirements of certain species. So you can get very, very niche type egg foods to suit various different birds. For example, the one you can see on here is actually primarily based for citizine species and species that rely on nectar. But there are many other different types of egg foods that you can get that meet these nutritional requirements of the young birds. Germinated seed is once again a very popular one amongst Fringillidae family finches for rearing their chicks. It has an increased vitamin and mineral content, higher protein availability, and a higher digestibility, because this type of seed, when you germinate it, it increases all of these values by adding the water. It produces different enzymes, and it's perfect for the chicks being reared, and really helps them to develop as strong and as healthy as possible. And then finally is vegetables. Vegetation is a natural part of most diet. So broccoli, peas, and carrots are particular favorites and provide also hydration to the growing chicks that is really important in hot weather. And once again, they're very soft, so they're incredibly palatable for these young birds, and it's extremely important that we do offer that variety to have a well-balanced diet for the birds. So, something that is very much a concern in pretty much all bird species, never mind just Fringillidae family birds, but particularly with these birds, they're very small, they're very sensitive, therefore things can go wrong, and we must have a plan B in place if we're to successfully breed these birds over many different generations. So what I like to do, particularly again, these are small birds, things can go wrong. It can be temperature fluctuations, it can be disturbance to the parents. There's many different things, but having hand rearing equipment available when you're breeding these birds is absolutely crucial. Sometimes you might use it as a method of topping up the birds. Maybe their parents have got a very large clutch. The chicks are not getting as much food as ideal. So what you would do is offer the chicks a little bit extra food where the parents haven't been able to provide it. Otherwise, you might end up in situations where chicks have been abandoned. Therefore, having syringes, having different forms of of rearing formulas is really important, so that we can successfully breed these species if parent rearing isn't the option. Now, my preference always is for parent rearing. It gives the chicks the most close to natural rearing type as you possibly can. It gives the birds the behavior, it gives them the experience. So when they come to breed themselves, you are likely to get much better, more positive outcomes. But hand rearing, once again, is a very useful tool, and it's something that all aviculturists should absolutely learn and experience at some point, because it can be the difference between losing a very expensive, very rare, very sensitive species or not. So let's say the chicks have now been reared successfully by the parent birds. That is just one of many hurdles in the chicks' development as they grow. So the chicks have approached approximately 10 to 15 days old. It's generally anywhere around 2 weeks old that chicks will begin to fledge. So this is the largest problem. Sometimes you can get injuries from these chicks fledging. It can be sometimes they've left the nest prematurely. They have been pushed out by the parents. They have been spooked. Something can make them jump early, or you can get natural fledgings. So my first piece of advice when you've got young birds fledging the nest is to offer some soft surface underneath that is likely to cushion the fall of these birds to make sure that they land as injury-free as possible. It's always something that's going to happen. It occurs all the time in the wild, and it often relies on the parent birds choosing a good place to nest. Of course, we can manipulate this in captivity by putting the nest sites in areas that we know are safe for the chicks. So always offer something for the chicks to perch on and something soft to break their fall should they struggle to make it down from the nest successfully. So this is a baby hawfinch. This is exactly what they look like at around 12 days old. They can't use their wings at this point. They actually really do struggle to perch as well, although this one is doing particularly well with his fluffy little earmuffs there. So they're a fantastic little species like that. But they do fledge the nest very, very early in their development stages. So they fledged the nest successfully, and the parents are continuing to rear them. Once again, when they're first fledging the nest, you must absolutely make sure you keep a close eye and attention to these chicks, because sometimes the parents can forget about them and stop feeding them, and you therefore will lose chicks if this occurs. But the chicks have perhaps started to grow a little bit now. After fledging the nest, they have discovered their wings and the fact that they can actually fly, and therefore will start going to the parents for food. Now, it's as they approach 30 days old that you will see the chicks will begin to try and feed themselves. Now, again, this is pretty much universal across all Fringillidae family finch species. They will be fairly reliant on their parents up until 25 to 30 days. And then after then, they have often worked out how to feed themselves. They are developed enough and mature enough that they would then naturally in the wild disperse and hang away from the parents, or the parents would chase them off. But of course, in captivity, that's not always the case. And with particularly larger or more intelligent species, such as the hawfinches, they do take a little bit longer. So we've got to make sure that they are not going to starve, therefore offering once again these more palatable foods, the foods that they are being reared on. So these small soft insects and these small vegetables that are once again ideally boiled and prepared to be very soft and palatable for the birds is absolutely crucial, because otherwise they will starve and you'll see welfare problems with those birds, and they might even pass away should they be stopped feeding altogether. So then it's time for these birds to molt. So they have successfully matured and began feeding themselves as they have left the parents. And this is always, very much a sensitive time for them. It's very difficult for them. It's very stressful for them, but they've got through this period and now they begin to molt. And it's the molting that occurs at approximately 45 days, so 6 to 8 weeks old. These birds begin to replenish all of their feathers on their body, except their flight feathers on their wings and their tail feathers. It's a really stressful period. It has very high nutritional demands and energy requirements. Therefore, offering foods that have previously not been offered, which are richer in protein, fats, and vitamins and minerals, are essential to help the young survive this period. And additionally, offering supplements is an absolute must for these sorts of species if their natural diet is not being followed to the most precise sort of ways it can be. What you often will see from these birds is vitamin deficiencies that can lead to loss of particularly vibrant plumage, and even in some cases you will see these birds begin to develop behavioral and structural problems because they just haven't been receiving the nutrition that they require. So offering these really rich foods is absolutely vital to them, and offering these supplements as well. So that is just a quick overview of what it's like to breed most of these finch species. So now what I'm going to go on to is talk about a couple of things with the pairing and the management of these birds, which is more of the sort of theoretical side, and then we'll also go on to talk about the conservation for different Fringillidae family finches and what that looks like going into the future. So again, just a couple of definitions to make sure that we're all well familiar with what we're talking about today. The first is selective breeding. So this is a practice that's often seen in private aviculture with finches, selecting for desired phenotypes such as the shape, the size, or the colour. Particularly in Europe and in the US, you often see these birds selected for very, very specific traits. It can be tiny differences in their colour. It can be tiny differences to their size or shape, which will gradually almost domesticate these birds and make them unrecognizable from their wild counterparts. You'll get line breeding as well. Again, a very common practice in exhibition studs of private aviculture. And this is to increase the chances of the offspring producing desirable traits and increase an offspring show quality, as it's called. So line breeding is where you're breeding these birds that are really quite closely related, because you're amplifying the desirable genes in these birds to pass on to the offspring to have these more desirable traits. You'll get outbreeding. Outbreeding is very much a standard practice across conservation aviculture and zoological collections, and this is to increase genetic diversity and heterozygosity in the offspring. And this is raises fertility, the vigor of these birds, and usually an organism's ability to adapt as well. So this is a really key part of managing these birds. And all birds, and most species in all honesty, is outbreeding them or keeping it as genetically diverse as possible to guarantee that the health of these birds is going to be as high as it possibly can. And then finally is something I wanted to quickly touch on, which is hybridization. This is the process of breeding birds together of two different species. So it's something that is becoming more frequent in private aviculture as the availability of gene pools is decreasing. You're seeing rare bird species becoming rarer, and therefore just the availability bringing birds in that are completely unrelated or as unrelated as possible to the founder stock is becoming particularly low. So hybrids between these closely related species is actually a more common practice and looks like it may become something that continues into the future when we need to add that genetic diversity into particularly small populations. And it's just worth remembering, one of the things at least that we're always taught in the UK in school is that hybrids are infertile. Whilst this is generally the case for most hybrids, very much within breeding birds of the same genus, as we're going to talk about, you will often find that hybrids are in fact fertile and produce viable offspring. Therefore, you do find that in some species, one in particular that has been much of scientific debate recently is redpolls. They are very much a bird that has seen this hybridization occurring between subspecies, let's say, and therefore they're all becoming really merged, but you are seeing healthier birds as a result. So conservation then. Let's talk about the conservation side of aviculture and breeding Fringillidae family finches. Because what I'm keen to do is say how that we can take the practices that we've been talking about so far and turn them into a real world context and have real world implications. So this bird right here is known as a twite. It is something that I'm particularly well known for, is we have a conservation breeding project for twites, and it's the only conservation and reintroduction project for this species in the world that I run. So a little quick introduction. They're a very small granivorous bird belonging to the Fringillidae family, of course. They only weigh approximately 15 grams and are only 5 inches long, very, very small species. They're found in Northern Europe. Then there's about 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers of divide. And then there is a large and actually looks like a growing and expanding population of them in Central Asia as well. So they're becoming quite common across the Northern Hemisphere in various subspecies, but other subspecies are very much declining. They inhabit grassland and moorland, so they're not something that you will often see in parks or gardens like you might see many other finch species, but are very much a very adapted bird to these highland areas. And the project that I'm working on with them is with the British endemic subspecies, which is known as the pipilans. Now, something that makes these birds particularly unique as a finch is they have really, really, in all honesty, weird nesting behavior. You often see with pretty much all finches, all Fringillidae family, and most birds in general will nest high up off the floor in shrubs or trees. But that is very much not the case for twites. Twites nest on the ground. They nest in these little scrapings in the floor underneath these very small shrubs, so bracken and heather that grow in these highland areas, and they'll make these little scrapings into the dirt and they'll line it with roots and some wool and these smaller fibers, and then they'll lay 5 little eggs in there. So very unusual behavior from a finch is nesting on the floor out of choice. Again, the behavior of these birds, they're very, very sociable. They're always found in flocks at all times of year. So generally smaller flocks when they're breeding in the spring and summer months. And then in the winter months, they will congregate on the coastlines in flocks of hundreds, if not thousands, of these birds. And that is where they will often form their pairs throughout the winter. So even though they're actually a very sociable species, they're actually highly monogamous once again, like the hawfinches. They form these pair bonds, and only one male will mate with one female in one breeding season. They aren't like other finches, like you might see, for example, redpolls, or closely related cousins to these twites or linnets, where they will have a small flock breeding and you will have one male mating with multiple different females. Very much not the case for twites. So this figure right here is taken from a study on twite migrations in Western Europe. And it was a study looking at approximately 23,000 individual records for Twite movements in the bird ringing records across Europe. And what you can see on here, and I'm going to try and simplify this to make it as easy to follow as possible, is you have in purple these areas where the birds overwinter from approximately October through to March. And then in the green, you have these more northern breeding grounds, which is where the birds will then migrate to. And the lines, of course, are the birds moving from the breeding grounds down to these overwintering sites. Now, what you can see on here is a dotted line between the British Isles and mainland Europe, and that is the divide between the endemic British subspecies and the European mainland subspecies. Now, what this study uncovered was the fact that initially what was thought to happen with twites is the subspecies would regularly interbreed and there would be a lot of gene flow between these birds, where actually there was only 5 or 6 very, very small, less than 10 individual records of birds crossing over that divide. And it was always British birds accidentally getting swept away in the sort of bad winds and ending up on mainland Europe. So we had to keep them as 2 separate subspecies. So the UK population, what is the basis for us doing a conservation breeding project with twites? Well, there's been a 72% decline in the population between 1999 to 2013. It was at a similar trajectory prior to 1999, and since 2013 has continued at that similar trajectory, as well. They're now red listed in the UK, so they were once a bird that was in huge populations, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them in the UK, and they've seen a decline over the past 60 to 80 years that has seen them now become red listed. 98% of that population is found in Scotland, so in the very north of the British Isles, which is approximately 2,000 birds, meaning that only 2%, which is approximately, that we know of, 12 birds remain in the whole of England. And considering there were hundreds of thousands of them not too long ago, they've had a monumental decline, so much so that the population has become fragmented and no longer links up with the rest of their own subspecies. So they are now an isolated population that are continuing to decline. The reasons for the decline, very quickly, were changes in agriculture, meaning that we're ending up with larger fields with less diversity of crops. This is meaning that the birds have less food availability. Overgrazing from livestock, particularly sheep, in the areas that these birds breed and feed, means that the crops that they would naturally be feeding and having as seeds are no longer maturing because they are being eaten by sheep, or the areas they breed are being eaten and trampled by sheep, and therefore the birds cannot breed successfully. Climate change is very much another one. With the increasing in temperatures, it has led to a loss of peat soils, which are very acidic soils that occur in these mountainous regions where these birds breed. And it's therefore meaning that the habitat is shrinking. And finally, as a more recent issue, is genetic diversity. The birds are becoming inbred in that very small population of only 12 birds. They have not had any single new recruitments, new genes coming into their population for what is believed to be several generations now. So much so that of the birds that are remaining, because they are becoming so inbred, 9 of them are males, 3 of them are females, and only 1 of the females is believed to even be fertile and therefore able to produce offspring because of the lack of gene flow and these birds becoming very inbred. So what's our plan and how are we going to apply these avicultural techniques to save this bird species? So it's based on conservation breeding. We're going to be captive breeding from 30 plus pairs of birds. The reason for this is it meets the minimum viable population rule in conservation genetics, where you have 50 birds to prevent inbreeding depression and 500 to prevent genetic drift. So by having at least 30 pairs of these birds initially is going to help solve those genetic issues as we look to re-establish populations of them across England. We need to encourage natural behaviour because this is a species that were very much kept and bred like canaries in the UK and Europe in small cages that we saw earlier. We need to rewild them. We need to make these birds able to adapt to life in the wild. Therefore, what we're going to be doing is gradually shifting the environments that they're kept and bred in to be more like nature so they can develop and grow with these natural behaviors. And finally, is promoting random mate choice in the species. Again, something we're guilty of as humans when we have birds in aviculture is picking birds that might be more friendly to breed from because they're easier for us to manage. Or it might be we're picking birds that have got a more depth of colour or a particularly nice shape or some really nice markings to them as birds we want to breed from. But this wouldn't occur in the wild. So we need to replicate the wild mating systems as much as we possibly can. So we're going to quickly talk about year one of the project. We had the first birds in the autumn of 2023. The first breeding season was the spring of 2024, and it was in this very small block of aviaries in my back garden. Again, very small block of aviaries, very much a clinical setup for this species, keeping it familiar with what they had been kept in and had become habituated to for many decades of captive breeding prior. So very small plastic aviaries that the birds will be used to give us the best chance of breeding success. We had an excellent start for breeding them. We produced 20 chicks from 5 pairs of birds, which was a really pleasing result, an average of 4, which even though they are birds that may produce up to 15 chicks per pair, as a first start, we did manage to breed 20 birds, which was very pleasing. So what milestones did we achieve in the first year of the project? Because we knew that to get these birds from captive bred avicultural birds into birds that could be released, we had to change the behavior. The first thing, which you can see in the center of your screen, is birds building a nest, which is a freestanding nest. The common practice for them is to give them preformed nests and just let the birds build inside these preformed nests or just lay their eggs in these nests. Whereas actually what we did was let them build their own completely from scratch by offering small shrubs in their aviaries, and they weaved in these little nests into these shrubs and built for themselves, which was extremely pleasing. The next was getting them to nest on the floor. A common practice again in aviculture is putting nest sites for these birds to breed in at our convenience, which is around 5 to 6 feet off the floor. So it means we don't have to bend down. We can check the chicks much easier. We don't have to go looking through lots of vegetation for them. What we did was put bowls on the floor for these birds to choose to nest in, and it worked very well. We had a number of chicks produced by this. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen, you've got mum, and 3 weeks later, on the left-hand side, you've got 6 chicks, which are in that very same nest that hatched. So that was very pleasing as a result, as we encouraged that natural behavior and that natural instinct prevailed in the first year. Going into year 2 of the project, which was very pleasing once again, we had a good successful season the year prior. We produced 20 chicks, so we set up 12 pairs of birds for the season. Of course, as we grew this population, we needed more room and more capacity to breed these birds, not only for an increased volume of birds, but also increasingly making them more wild so that they could one day be reintroduced. We built these new aviaries. We've got a very large block of much larger. These were 3 times larger than they had been bred in the previous season. And this helped lower the aggression in the species. It helped keep the birds fit, which is always a concern with smaller finches, is having them not be exercised enough can lead to fertility problems. And we can then also make these aviaries more natural by planting them with these small shrubs, boulders, and soil that the birds would naturally be breeding in. Now, it was sadly a very challenging season because we had very extreme weather in the UK. These are a bird that are generally found in cooler regions of the planet. They're found in these northern regions with temperatures that fluctuate from minus 20 degrees Celsius in the winter to approximately 22-25 degrees Celsius in the summer months. In the UK, we had 35 to 40 degrees Celsius every single day, which does not suit these birds. And we also had a real lack of rain, meaning the humidity was very much lacking for them. So this ended up with many different problems where eggs were dehydrating, they were having much quicker weight loss than they absolutely should be doing over the course of their incubation, meaning that eggs did often fail to hatch this season. What worked really nicely, however, was it was a great chance to learn and understand what had gone wrong and therefore how we can prevent this happening in the future. So despite these problems, we learned something from it and we still did produce quite a good volume of chicks regardless. The future aims are to continue building up the parent stock population up to 60 plus individuals. At the moment, the population of twites in my aviaries is sat at 45, which is more than exists in the wild in England, which is very, very pleasing. We're going to be continuing to breed twites in wild type aviaries, mimicking what they would be breeding in naturally, because this is exactly how the birds are going to be breeding when they eventually do end up being reintroduced. We're going to work on a reintroduction strategy to look at various different sites that would be suitable for them, that have been restored, that are safe for them to migrate across. They are safe for them to breed on with no problems with disturbance from livestock. There's no further problems with pesticides or chemicals being used on the crops that they would naturally feed on. So we've got a couple of different areas bookmarked as what we're going to be looking for as releasing sites. And then we think the first releases will occur in 2027 and 2028, providing that we have adapted our practices from this summer to helping manage the heat and humidity problems that we had, and therefore having enough birds to start to release in the next 18 months or so. And this is what we're hoping that through the avicultural management expertise we've applied to this species, we're going to be seeing right across moorlands in the UK very, very soon. So that is pretty much sort of where the end of this presentation comes to on breeding Fringillidae family finches. If you'd just like to see more and learn a little bit more about what I do as myself, first off, you can find myself, Oliver Crowther, on LinkedIn. But you can also check out my social media, which is OC Aviary. You can see my logo in the bottom right corner. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, which promotes all things to do with aviculture, the conservation side of things, the zoo side of things, and then really good entertaining trips as well to many different fanciers. So you can find us online on there. And then now I'd just like to invite you to a little Q&A session. And obviously, I think there might be some intervention as well that we'll talk with the Life Science Education Trust as well. So thank you very much, everybody. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you for the session, sir. If anybody has any questions, please ask.
If anyone has any question, you can just put it in the chat box, or also feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions.
I put it in my chat box.
Okay, we'll just.
Average mortality. Okay, so the average mortality for this season was fairly high because of what happened with the extreme weather conditions. So the normal mortality rates that we'd see when breeding the twites, for example, would generally be 5% of chicks you would expect to lose from various problems. Sometimes it might be parent birds stop feeding them. it can sometimes be stresses on these birds that you can naturally lose them from. However, this year it was much higher. It was around 40%, and that was not so much in the chicks that hatched, but rather the eggs. We had extremely high mortality rates because of the extreme weather in the eggs. We had 40% probably in chicks, which is higher than it should be, but almost, I would suggest, 60% in the eggs, which is a real shame. But again, just comes from unfavorable environmental conditions that make it really difficult for them to breed in. Do finches have specific feed formulations for hand feeding? What are the problems we may encounter if you feed them general formulation of birds? So yes, there is specific finch hand rearing formulas that you can find on the market. Again, it very much depends on the type of finches. Finches are a very diverse group. As we mentioned earlier, the nutritional requirements are very different depending on different species. You can have some, for example, hawfinches, that are very much requiring the insects to feed their chicks on. So if you used to get a specific hand feeding formulation, you would go for an insect-based one with insect protein. For the twites, for example, twites don't feed their chicks on insects, nor do they feed them particularly much on vegetables. They primarily feed their chicks on seed. Therefore, what you have to do with those is feed them a hand-rearing formula that is designed for grainivores, which is actually more commonly than anything columbiform hand-rearing formulas. So pigeon and dove formulas seems to be the best thing for hand-rearing young twites. They want the grains, and this is a grain-based formulation. So again, it depends on the species, but you can get insect, fruit, and grain seed-based formulations depending on the species.
Any more questions?
You're very welcome, no problem. Is there any more questions? Anybody want to unmute? Any questions, please, at all? It's a good time to ask and have different chats through things. Type of insect species should we provide for the diet? Great question. So again, it does depend on the finch species. Some prefer more smaller insect species, some prefer larger. Now, in my experience, for most finches, the things that you want to be feeding them on are mealworms. If you're going to feed mealworms, please bear in mind the nutritional requirements of mealworms aren't great. Therefore, you have to gut load them, which is where you might feed vegetables, you might feed fruit to them, you might feed different grains to them, so that they have this nutritional goodness inside the mealworm rather than just the mealworm itself. So mealworms are one. Maggots, so pinky maggots, you have to go for. Make sure that if you're going to feed the maggots, you don't feed them ones that have been reared on flesh. If you feed them maggots that have been reared on any form of meat or even fish, they will often contain botulism and certain diseases that come from the rotting meat that can therefore affect massively the health of the chicks. Therefore, having maggots that have been reared on vegetable matter is a much safer method. Buffalo worms, which are like very small mealworms, are particularly common and really good for them as well. Wax worms, very common, very, very popular, much higher in fat, but particularly useful for chicks. Calciworms, very, very important for the insectivore species, particularly because they've got a much higher calcium content, so it helps the development of bones in the chicks. So they are my general go-tos. Just a word of advice is if you're feeding finches live food, be very, very careful in feeding anything to the parent birds or chicks that has got a hard shell. So things like locust or cricket. Often the exoskeleton on these crickets, locusts, and things like that isn't digestible for young, immature, juvenile birds, and therefore it's actually likely to cause impactions in their stomach and their digestive system, or entirely stop them from being able to feed. So never feed hard-shelled insects to birds that are rearing chicks or the chicks themselves. Is it applicable to all varieties of finches? In India, we do apologize. In India, we have 7 types of finches: scaly-breasted, black-throated. I think if I'm corrected, so the scaly-breasted, do you mean the scaly-breasted weavers and the black-throated weavers, out of interest? The practices I've talking through today definitely do apply to those finch types that you have, 100%. And I have a lot of translation to that without a doubt. But you might find there's certain things that you do have to vary, because these types of birds might have slightly different nesting habitats. They might have slightly different nutritional requirements. But as general rules, yes, I would absolutely consider that. Maximum clutch size in captive breeding versus in the wild. What do you think the reintroduced twites will migrate? Okay, so the maximum clutch size in captive breeding versus in the wild. So it's very, very similar. You do get instances of captive bred finches, particularly Fringillidae family finches, which have accidentally usually been selected for larger clutch sizes. So if you have canaries that start laying clutch sizes of 6 or 7, and then you're breeding those chicks and then breeding those chicks back to other birds that have been parts of larger clutches, you do get that. So generally, as a rule, the wild clutches are between 3 to 4, sometimes 5 eggs for finches. I'd say the common clutch sizes are 4 to 5. In captivity, it is very rare to get anything less than 5 eggs, and is more common to get 6 eggs. More so now than ever, is you will have birds having regularly 5 to 6 eggs, and as well multiple clutches. They might have clutches of 3, 4 clutches a year. I wouldn't recommend going any more than 3, because it can impact the welfare of the parent birds that are breeding. But you often see the clutch sizes increase in captivity for sure, as they've got these more, again, favourable, more nutritious diets. And on to the twites migrating. Yes, we do think they'll migrate. So, we think it's a natural instinct. It's going to be a natural instinct for them anyway. We intend on where we'll be releasing twites will be where twites will naturally have inhabited. So they'll probably follow the same flyways as twites will have done in many years prior. But we also think if we're looking to bolster the population, for example, in England, that is remaining because they are genetically inbred, the released birds, the reintroduced birds, will actually just follow the same migration as the wild birds, and we'll sort of look to them for guidance. So whilst we're not quite sure, because there hasn't been many finch or small passerine reintroduction projects, it's something that we're going to be looking at in time, and we're going to having trackers on these birds and a lot of monitoring to fully understand what they're like from a behavioural perspective. Any supplements during the preparation for breeding season, and any benefit with freshly prepared egg food? So freshly prepared egg food is absolutely vital. I always do egg foods where you'll have your basic, your crumb mix, whether it be dry or moist, and then you'll also add various vegetables to that as well. So definitely freshly prepared egg food every single day is really important to give the birds the freshest foods that are going to be free from disease. Very, very important for them to have successful breedings and overall good health in the birds. In terms of supplements, particularly when breeding, I would always say a vitamin supplement up or in the run up to the breeding season, perhaps when you've got birds starting to go to nest and lay eggs, just to make sure there's no vitamin deficiencies, because you do occasionally get birds that might not take in all the nutrition from the food that would be ideal. But the main really important one is calcium. A calcium supplement is absolutely vital for them, particularly for the laying hens. As you can imagine, they have a higher calcium requirement to produce the eggshells. And if they don't have calcium or enough calcium available in their diet, they will pull the calcium from their bones, which they make their bones weak, and will again lower the welfare of these birds. So make sure offering a calcium supplement when hens are laying eggs is absolutely crucial for a successful breeding season. How did you choose the stock population of hawfinches? So I'll be completely honest with you. With the hawfinches, they're not something that are too commonly bred. So you're very much, when you're forming your parent stock population, is more based around what can you find that is captive bred and legitimate birds compared to wild caught. Again, it's a very almost non-existent issue now in the UK for wild caught birds, but it's always something we have to consider to make sure that everything's done legally, of course. But with the hawfinches, again, they're hard to breed. Not many people keep them, so it's kind of what I could find, and therefore, I'll be honest, I got lucky in a sense that the pair that I managed to get together were compatible. They could very much have hated each other and decided that they wanted nothing to do with each other and not bred for us. So, it had to be choosing birds that I thought would be compatible. And ideally what that is young birds that have not bred and therefore not bonded before, because they don't have any loyalty to another bird that they've previously been housed or bred with. So that would be that's sort of the main method I took to getting the hawfinches breeding. And because I've managed to breed one this year as well, I've managed to organise a young unrelated hen coming for him that was also bred this year. So I'm going to have unrelated stock, which is ideal, but also birds that have not been previously paired. So it's more likely to form these successful breeding pairs. How have you encountered the micro and macro sized eggs in a clutch? Yes, I absolutely have. I have had very, very rarely, in all honesty, but I've had it more so with canaries than anything else. I've had absolutely tiny micro eggs that are completely egg white, so there's absolutely no yolk in there, anything like that for them. They will not develop, they are not fertile. So I haven't experienced that, and I have had the extremely large eggs produced as well. Again, very, very rare, and it's a more common occurrence in the sort of immature birds that are breeding for the first time, that have perhaps just not fully matured in their sort of reproductive system, therefore produce eggs that are slightly larger or slightly smaller than ideal. Usually it sorts itself out after the bird has laid a couple of eggs, but I have had experience with that before.
Okay. Thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you, sir, for answering all the questions.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. You're very welcome.
So on behalf of the entire team of Life Science Education Trust, I would like to thank you, sir. It was an honor to have you today, and we hope the insights from your session will inspire many of us to pursue this field with the same passion and dedication that you bring. We would also like to thank all the attendees of the webinar for being very active participants. We request you to please fill the feedback forms so that we can issue the participant certificates. The link to the feedback form is already shared in the chat box. Before we conclude, I would like to once again remind you about the programs offered by LSeT, the one-year diploma in animal care and management, and the animal care bootcamp with the upcoming batch in January 2026. For any further information, please connect with the numbers mentioned on the screen. Thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to see many of you take the next steps in this journey with LSeT. Thank you and good night.